The townsfolk said she'd had her time, her beauty faded, her worth spent. Her husband was the cruelest among them. One morning, with a sneer and a signed paper, he gave her away to a slave he'd won in a card game. The crowd laughed, thinking it punishment for both. But when the man took her hand, there was no mockery in his eyes, only quiet strength, and something she hadn't felt in years: respect. That night, she wept in shame and disbelief, but he said softly, "You're free now, even if the world don't see it." And in that moment, she realized the love she was thrown into was worth more than any man's pride, or the chains that bound them both. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The morning light crept through the cracks in the cabin's walls like cautious fingers, painting the rough floorboards in lines of pale gold and dust. She woke slowly, her throat dry, her body stiff from the hard cot beneath her, half expecting to feel the weight of a man beside her, or worse, the sound of laughter from another room. But there was only silence, broken by the faint scrape of metal against wood and the smell of coffee brewing over a small fire. For a moment she didn't move, afraid that if she opened her eyes fully, the dream would end and she'd be back in the saloon, back in the noise and shame of the night before. But the world stayed still, soft, and real. She sat up, the coarse blanket slipping from her shoulders, and saw him through the open doorway. The man she'd been given to. He was outside, crouched by the fire pit, turning a skillet with practiced slowness. The morning sun caught on the sweat at his temples, and she could see now how broad he was, his shirt worn thin at the shoulders, the muscles beneath marked with old scars. He didn't look up when she stirred, didn't greet her with words or eyes, just kept moving steady, deliberate, like a man who knew the fragility of quiet. Her heart thudded hard against her ribs, a strange mix of fear and confusion. This was the moment she'd braced for all night, the cruelty she'd been taught to expect, the debt he would surely collect. But instead, when he finally turned and saw her standing there in the doorway, he only nodded once and said, "Food's near ready." His voice was low, rough like the desert wind, but there was no edge to it. No hunger, no command, just fact. She didn't answer, didn't trust her voice not to betray her trembling. He gestured toward a stool by the fire, and when she didn't move, he stepped back from it, leaving space between them, as though her fear were a boundary he wouldn't cross. She watched him from the corner of her eye as he poured black coffee into a tin cup and set it on the table beside her, the steam curling in the cold air. Then he placed a small plate of eggs and cornbread beside it, the meal simple but hot, the kind she hadn't tasted in months. She kept her hands in her lap, waiting for the trap, the sneer, the mocking word, the reminder of who owned who, but it never came. He only said, "Eat while it's warm," before turning back to the fire. Her stomach ached with hunger, but pride held her still. Finally, she asked, her voice breaking the hush, "Why are you doing this?" He didn't turn. "Because you haven't eaten," he said. "And because I reckon you've been talked to enough for one lifetime." The words caught her off guard, sharp in their gentleness. She looked down at the food, then back at him, studying the way his hands moved, careful, precise. The hands of someone used to mending more than breaking. Something inside her shifted, small and painful, like a wound learning how to close. She lifted the cup, the coffee burning bitter and clean down her throat, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like someone's property, just a woman waking to a world she didn't yet understand. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "You don't have to be kind." He looked up then, his eyes dark and unreadable in the morning light. "Maybe not," he said. "But I remember what it's like when no one is." And with that, he turned back to his work, leaving her in silence once more, but now it was a silence that didn't feel empty. It felt like peace, fragile but real, as the fire crackled and the world outside began again. The days passed slow beneath the pale sweep of the prairie sky, each one blurring into the next with the quiet rhythm of work and weather. She rose before dawn now, drawn by the faint sounds of him moving outside, the steady rhythm of an axe splitting wood, the low hum of his breath against the morning chill. At first, she stayed inside, her shame an invisible shackle that kept her tethered to the cot, to the small cabin that smelled of smoke and soap and solitude. She couldn't look at him for long, not even when he spoke. Every kindness he showed her seemed to scrape against the years of cruelty she'd grown used to, stirring something she didn't know how to carry. When he fixed the door that hung crooked on its hinge, she tried to thank him, but the words came out too soft, like an apology. When he handed her his coat one cold evening, she hesitated before taking it, afraid it was a test, a kindness meant to make her small again. But he never demanded gratitude, never reminded her of what the world said she owed him. "You're free to go if you want," he said one afternoon as they worked side by side mending the fence line, his voice quiet but certain. "Don't owe me a thing." She'd nearly dropped the wire she was holding. No man had ever spoken to her that way, not with permission, not with the kind of respect that made her feel more human than she had in years. She managed a bitter laugh, her eyes burning as she looked toward the horizon. "Go where?" she said. "Back to the folks who laughed when I was sold?" The wind carried her words away, but he didn't press. "Then stay," he said simply. "But stay because you choose to, not cause somebody told you to." That night, when he sat by the fire whittling at a scrap of wood, she watched him from across the room, her hands folded in her lap, her heart heavy with something she couldn't name. His face was quiet, calm, his features softened by the glow of the flames, and she realized he hadn't once looked at her with hunger or pity. He looked at her like she was a person. That small mercy, so simple, so foreign, unraveled her more than cruelty ever had. She turned away, tears pricking her eyes, hating herself for wanting his kindness, for needing it. Shame had been her armor for so long that she didn't know how to live without it. But each day, he wore it down not with words, but with silence, with steady patience, with the way he'd leave half his meal for her when she thought he wasn't watching, or the way he'd set her tools in a neat line, ready for her work, without ever asking if she'd join him. Once, when her fingers brushed his as they passed a water pail, she flinched, expecting the sharpness of a man's claim. But he only stepped back, giving her space, his voice low. "Didn't mean to startle you." The apology, quiet as it was, hollowed her chest with its gentleness. Later, lying awake on the cot, she stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant call of nightbirds and the low creak of the wind against the walls, and she realized she'd spent her whole life learning to survive men like her husband, and not a single moment learning how to be seen by someone like this. She didn't know if she deserved it, this strange, careful grace. But when dawn broke again and she found him outside boiling water for coffee, his back turned to her as if to grant her privacy and her silence, she felt her shame crack, not gone, not healed, but shifted, making room for something she didn't dare yet call hope. The whispers began like wind through dry grass, soft, scattered, almost harmless, until they grew into a chorus that followed her wherever she went. Whenever she rode into town for supplies, she could feel the eyes on her, pricking her skin like thorns beneath the shawl she wore tight around her shoulders. The general store fell quiet the moment she stepped through its door. The squeak of her boots against the floorboards, the only sound brave enough to break the silence. Mrs. Wilkes, the storekeeper's wife, forced a brittle smile as she handed over flour and coffee, her voice sugar-sweet but her eyes sharp with judgment. "Heard you've taken up out near the creek," she said, sliding the goods across the counter. "Quite the arrangement, from what folks say. Must be a comfort, having a man around again, any man at all." The words stung, but she kept her face still, her hands steady. "We work the land together," she said softly. "That's all." But Mrs. Wilkes only hummed, lips pursed like she'd bitten into something sour. Outside, a pair of men laughed loud enough for her to hear. One of them, Jed Hensley, her husband's drinking companion, calling out, "Guess she found herself a new master after all." Their laughter rolled down the street, coarse and cruel, while a child on the porch of the blacksmith's shop watched her with wide, confused eyes. She forced herself not to flinch, not to run, though her hands trembled beneath her shawl. Pride was a fragile thing, but she'd learned how to wear it like armor. When she returned home that evening, Isaiah was chopping wood behind the cabin, his shirt damp with sweat, his arms moving in a steady rhythm that matched the beat of her own anger. He looked up as she rode in, his brow furrowing at her silence. "They've been talking," she said finally, her voice cracking despite her best efforts. "About us. About me." He set the axe aside, wiped his hands on a rag, and waited. "Ain't nothing new for them to talk about folks who don't fit their picture of the world," he said quietly. "Don't make their words true. She wanted to believe him, but the shame still burned under her skin. "They think I've fallen," she whispered, "that I've lost what little I had left." Isaiah stepped closer, his shadow long in the fading light. "They think a lot of things," he said, "but they ain't the ones living your life." He paused, his gaze steady, warm, and unyielding. "You still carry yourself like a woman who remembers who she was, even after they tried to take it from you. That's more than most of them can say." His words struck something deep in her, something she didn't know she still had. But even as the evening settled around them, the sting of the town's judgment lingered. Each whisper felt like a weight pressing her lower, reminding her of how fragile her place in the world had become. That night, as they ate in silence, she stared into the fire and said, "They'll never see us as anything but wrong." He didn't look up from his plate. "Maybe not," he said, "but we don't live for their seeing." She turned his words over in her mind long after he'd gone to bed, listening to the wind scratch against the windows, carrying with it echoes of laughter, of scorn, of the life she'd left behind. Yet beneath all that noise, she could still hear his voice quiet, steady, sure as if it were the only truth the world hadn't managed to twist. By the time the fire burned low, she understood something she hadn't dared admit. The town's shame couldn't touch her unless she let it. She was no man's wife, no man's property, no man's prize. And though the world would call her fallen, she knew she was only now beginning to rise. The night was heavy with stillness, the kind that pressed against the walls of the cabin until even the fire dared not crackle too loud. She lay awake, staring at the faint glow of embers, listening to Isaiah's slow breathing from the chair by the hearth. Sleep had become easier these days, safer somehow, but that night, a whisper caught her ear, low and rhythmic, like the murmur of water against stone. She turned slightly, careful not to rustle the blanket, and saw him sitting upright, head bowed, hands clasped tight. His lips moved in a language she didn't know, the words rolling soft and steady, ancient as the earth itself. It wasn't a sound of pleading or desperation, it was reverent, almost peaceful, and when he spoke her name in the midst of it, her breath caught in her throat. No one had ever said it that way, not as ownership, not as pity, but as prayer. She didn't interrupt, didn't move, only watched as he lifted his gaze toward the dying fire, his expression distant, filled with a sorrow that made her chest ache. When morning came, she found him outside, splitting wood as though nothing had passed, though his movements carried a heaviness she hadn't seen before. She waited until the sun cleared the ridge before she finally asked, her voice trembling in the quiet, "Who were you praying to?" He paused mid-swing, the axe buried deep in the stump, then rested his hands on the handle. For a long time, he said nothing, only stared out across the field where the mist clung low and pale. "To the ones who came before me," he said finally. "The ones who kept me alive when no one else would." His tone was steady, but his eyes were far away. Watching ghosts she couldn't see. She stepped closer, her hands tightening in her shawl. "You said my name," she whispered. "Why?" He looked down at the ground, his jaw working. "Because I was thanking them for you," he said softly. "Didn't think I'd ever have reason to thank anyone again." The words hit her like a blow, not from their tenderness but from the weight behind them, the kind that came from years of loss. She swallowed hard. "You said once you were a slave," she said carefully. "But you weren't born that way, were you?" His silence stretched long before he answered. "No," he said finally. "I was born free. My father had land in the Carolinas before the war. We worked it, bled for it, thought freedom was something you could build if you were strong enough to hold it." He let out a breath, half laugh, half bitterness. "Then the war came, and I fought for the same flag your husband carried." Her chest tightened. "You knew him?" His gaze lifted to hers, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw real anger in his eyes, not toward her, but toward memory itself. "Saved his life once," Isaiah said. "Pulled him out from under gunfire near Shiloh. Thought it meant something then. Thought men who fought side by side might stay equal when the guns went quiet. But when the smoke cleared, he made sure I was taken in chains instead." Her breath caught, disbelief flooding her. He enslaved you?" Isaiah nodded slowly. "Traded my life for his comfort. Said it was just the way of things. Told me a man like me owed him more than gratitude. The words hung in the air like a curse, too heavy to breathe. She staggered back, one hand pressed to her mouth as the truth tore through her. Her husband's cruelty was not born of pride alone, but of theft. He'd stolen this man's freedom and, years later, tried to steal her soul. "I didn't tell you," Isaiah said quietly, "because I didn't want you to carry his sins. You've carried enough." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You should hate me," she whispered, "for what he did, for what I was part of." He stepped forward then, slow and certain, his voice low. "You ain't him," he said, "and I ain't the man he tried to make me." For a moment the world stilled, the wind, the trees, even her heartbeat. Then she reached out, laying her trembling hand against his, and for the first time, shame gave way not to guilt, but to grace. The late afternoon sun slanted through the cabin window, turning the dust in the air to drifting gold, soft and quiet as breath. He'd been working too long in the heat, and when he came back from the fields, sweat streaked his face and blood darkened the torn edge of his shirt. She saw it immediately, a reopened welt across his back, an old scar split where the lash had once cut deep. He moved as though he didn't feel it, as though pain were something that belonged to another man, not him, and she couldn't bear it. "Sit down," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. He hesitated, his brow furrowing, but she was already fetching the basin, the old rag, the bit of salve she'd mixed from herbs days ago. When she turned back, he stood still in the center of the room, the lamplight catching the tension in his jaw. "I said sit," she repeated, and he finally obeyed, lowering himself onto the edge of the cot, shoulders stiff, gaze fixed on the floorboards. She knelt behind him, the scent of sweat, leather, and earth clinging to his skin, and for a moment, her hands hovered, trembling, afraid to touch. "You don't have to," he murmured. "I've had worse." "Maybe so," she whispered, "but no one should bear it alone." She pressed the rag to his back, gentle at first, the blood smearing pink against the water. He flinched not from pain, but from the intimacy of it, and she felt her own breath catch. The scars told stories she didn't dare ask about. Years stolen, dignity stripped, flesh remembering what freedom costs. As she worked, she found herself whispering, "He did this to you, didn't he?" Her husband's face flashed in her mind, his smug grin, the way he'd spit the word property like it were holy truth. Isaiah said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. The rag slipped from her hand, and tears she hadn't meant to shed fell onto his shoulder. That's when he turned, slow and deliberate, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Don't," he said softly, and the words stopped her like a hand on her heart. "Don't look at me with sorrow." She blinked, stunned. "How am I supposed to look?" His gaze didn't waver. "Like I look at you." For a moment she didn't understand, but then she did, and it unraveled her completely. There was no pity in the way he saw her, no trace of the shame she'd been drowning in since the day she was sold. He looked at her like she was something still whole, still worth saving. The weight of that realization left her breathless. Slowly, she wiped her tears and met his eyes the way he asked, without guilt, without apology. Just a woman seeing a man. Not a slave, not a savior. Just him. His shoulders eased, his jaw unclenched, and something shifted in the room, subtle as a heartbeat. "There," he said quietly, nodding. "That's better." She smiled through the ache in her chest, and when she reached for the rag again, her hands no longer trembled. The silence between them felt different now, no longer heavy, but sacred, like the calm after a storm. When she finished, he stood and buttoned his shirt, the fabric clinging to skin still raw but healing. "Thank you," he said. And though it was a simple word, it carried more weight than any she'd ever heard. She wanted to tell him that he'd given her far more, that by refusing her pity, he'd taught her the meaning of dignity. But she stayed silent, because she knew he already understood. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of rain and promise. As the first drops began to fall, she watched him step into the open, his head tilted toward the sky, and realized that for the first time, she wasn't looking at him through her shame. She was looking at him through her heart. The sound of hooves shattered the quiet before dawn, echoing through the dry stillness like thunder over stone. She was outside hanging laundry, the cool air heavy with the smell of sage and coming rain, when she saw the dust rising on the horizon. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure took shape, broad-shouldered, arrogant in posture even from a distance, a man too sure of his own place in the world to imagine anyone might take it from him. Dalton Hensley, her husband. The sight of him dragged the breath from her lungs like a fist to the chest. The past she'd tried to bury came charging toward her on a fine horse and a trail of hate. Isaiah stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression unreadable but his stance shifting subtly protective, unyielding. When Dalton pulled up, the horse snorted, its sides heaving, and he swung down with the swagger of a man who thought the land still bowed to his boots. His eyes found her first, sweeping over her with a sneer that made her skin crawl. "Didn't take you long to play the whore, did it?" he spat. "Thought I'd done you a favor letting you rot out here. But I see you found yourself a new master." His words cut deep, but not like before. They didn't have the power to break her anymore, only to reveal the rot still festering inside him. She didn't flinch, didn't bow her head the way she once might have. Instead, she stood tall, the wind pulling at her hair as she said quietly, "You gave me away, Dalton. You don't get to own what you threw away." His face twisted, fury blooming red across his cheeks. "That piece of paper was a joke," he growled. "You think I'd really let him?" He jabbed a finger toward Isaiah, his voice dripping venom. "Keep what's mine." Isaiah stepped forward then, slow and deliberate, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. "You might want to take that finger back, mister," he said calmly, but the warning beneath it was clear as gunfire. Dalton's laugh was sharp and cruel. "You forget your place, boy," he sneered. "Your property. Always were. Always will be. Don't think putting on airs makes you anything more than what I paid for." The words hung between them, ugly and thick as smoke. Isaiah's jaw tightened, but he didn't move, didn't rise to the bait. "That's where you're wrong," he said evenly. "You never paid for me, you only bought your own damnation." The air shifted, the wind carrying the scent of rain and iron. Dalton's hand twitched toward his holster, but the woman stepped between them before the moment could explode into violence. Her heart pounded, fear clawing at her ribs, but her voice held steady. "Enough," she said. "If you came for your pride, you lost it the night you traded me like cattle. If you came for your wife, she's dead. You buried her yourself when you signed that paper." Dalton's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The fire in his eyes faltered, replaced by something she'd never seen in him before: doubt. For a heartbeat, the world was still. The wind hissed through the grass, the sky darkened, and thunder rumbled low over the hills. Isaiah took one step closer, his voice quiet but cold as stone. "You should leave before the storm breaks." Dalton's lip curled, but his hand dropped from his gun. He spat into the dirt, eyes flicking between them with a look that was equal parts hatred and fear. "This ain't over," he snarled, climbing back into the saddle. "You think the world'll forget what you are? A woman who laid down with a slave?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than any insult. As he rode away, the first raindrops began to fall, dotting the dust with dark spots that spread like blood. Isaiah stood beside her, the storm rising around them, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the man disappeared. "He'll be back," she whispered. Isaiah nodded once. "Then so will we," he said. And as the thunder cracked and the rain began to pour, she realized that for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what was coming. The world had already taken everything from her. Now, she had something worth fighting for. The storm had rolled in fast, dragging a curtain of gray across the sky and turning the earth to mud beneath their boots. But the real storm stood in the clearing: Dalton Hensley, pistol drawn, his eyes burning with the fevered rage of a man who couldn't stand to see the world move without him. Rain slicked his hair to his forehead, his fine coat soaked through, but pride made him stand tall as if arrogance could shield him from the truth he'd sown. Isaiah stepped forward slowly, his hands open at his sides, the firelight from the cabin glinting off the rain that ran down his face. "Ain't no call for that gun," he said, voice low, steady. "You want to talk? I'll listen. You want blood? You'll find none worth spilling here." Dalton sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Talk? I didn't come here for talk," he spat. I came for what's mine. He swung the barrel toward her, his smile twisting cruelly. You think a piece of paper changes what God wrote in law? You're my wife. You bear my name. And he jabbed the gun toward Isaiah. He's a thief who needs reminding of his place. Isaiah didn't move, but there was something in his stillness, something that drew the air tight, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Your place, Isaiah said softly, is in the past. Leave it there. The rain fell harder, soaking them all, thunder growling in the distance. Dalton laughed, the sound half madness, half desperation. You really think you can stand between me and what's mine? He shouted, and before anyone could stop him, he raised the pistol higher, aiming square at Isaiah's chest. And then she was moving. It wasn't thought. It wasn't plan. It was instinct, raw and fierce, born of every humiliation, every night of silence, every bruise her soul had carried. She stepped between them, the cold barrel of Dalton's pistol inches from her heart. Don't, Isaiah said, his voice breaking the tension like the crack of lightning, but she didn't flinch. The rain streaked down her face, mingling with tears she hadn't realized had fallen, and when she spoke, her voice was steady as steel. You can't sell what's already been given. Dalton blinked, confusion flickering behind his fury. She took another step closer, the muzzle of his gun brushing the fabric of her dress. You traded me away, remember? Wrote your name down on that paper and handed me to him like I was a thing. But what you didn't see, what you'll never see, is that you gave me my freedom that night. You sold your claim when you sold your soul. Her words hit like thunder, her tone calm but unyielding. Dalton's hand trembled, the gun wavering, his face twisting between rage and something close to fear. You think you can shame me? He hissed. You think the world will ever see you as anything but... Enough, she snapped, her voice cutting through the storm. The world's seen plenty of men like you. It's time it sees something else. Isaiah stepped closer now, slow and deliberate, his eyes locked on Dalton's trembling hand. You got a choice, he said quietly. You can ride away and keep breathing, or you can pull that trigger and find out what justice feels like when it finally looks you in the eye. Dalton looked between them, the rain pounding, the wind howling, the weight of the years he'd spent ruling through fear pressing down on him now like the earth itself. His lips curled, his pride screaming louder than reason, but deep down, he saw it. The end of his dominion. The breaking of the chain he thought unbreakable. With a final snarl, he lowered the pistol, spitting into the mud. You'll regret this, he growled. You'll both hang for it. Maybe, she said, her gaze unflinching. But at least we'll hang free. He turned and mounted his horse, kicking it hard, the sound of hooves fading into the storm until only the wind remained. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Isaiah stepped beside her, his breath visible in the cold air. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. She looked up at him, her heart steady for the first time in years. Yes, she whispered. I did. And as lightning split the sky behind them, she realized the truth: freedom wasn't something given. It was something you stood for, even if it meant standing in the way of a bullet. The night split open with the smell of smoke before the first shout ever reached the cabin. She woke to the crackle and roar of fire swallowing the dry grass outside, the orange light flickering through the window, like hell itself had come crawling up from the earth. Isaiah was already on his feet, yanking his boots on, the sound of horses and voices rising from the darkness beyond the fence. They're here, he said, his tone flat, too calm for the terror that slammed into her chest. She threw on her coat and stumbled to the door, her eyes wide as she saw the glow spreading across the fields, their wheat, their work, their home all burning under the vengeful hand of a man who couldn't stand to lose. Dalton had returned, and this time, he hadn't come alone. Shadows moved in the firelight, men with torches, rifles, the kind who laughed when cruelty wore the face of law. She saw his outline among them, his voice booming over the wind. You think you can steal what's mine and live to tell it? Burn it all. Isaiah grabbed the bucket by the well, hurling water at the creeping flames near the cabin wall, but the fire was hungry, too fast, too alive. She joined him, coughing as smoke clawed down her throat, her eyes stinging, her hands blistering from the heat. The night roared around them, chaos and hatred and the desperate will to survive. Dalton's men jeered from the shadows, their faces flickering like devils in the glow. "Let it burn," one of them shouted. "Ain't no place in this town for their kind." But then, from the dark, came another sound, a second set of hoofbeats, followed by voices, uncertain at first, then stronger. "That's enough, Hensley," a voice called. Through the haze, she saw Tom Reed, the blacksmith, riding up with two others, the same men who'd once laughed at her in the street. Behind them came Mrs. Wilkes, clutching a lantern, her hair loose, her face pale but fierce. "Put those torches down," she cried, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry. "There's been enough hate for one town." The mob hesitated, their fire-lit bravado faltering under the sight of familiar faces, neighbors, customers, kin. Isaiah froze for only a moment, then kept working the bucket line, and she followed his lead, hope flaring in her chest even as the flames raged higher. Tom dismounted, grabbed a shovel, and started beating at the fire near the barn. Another man joined him, then another. The mob's noise turned to confusion, anger slipping into uncertainty as the tide began to turn. Dalton shouted, his face red with fury. "You're all fools! You'll burn with them!" But his voice was lost in the storm of feet and hands, of townsfolk who'd once looked away but now refused to. The fire began to die, the wet earth swallowing the embers, the wind shifting away from the cabin. When the last flame sputtered out, only the smoke remained, rising into the night like a ghost of everything they'd survived. Dalton sat on his horse, glaring down at the crowd that no longer stood with him. "You'll regret this," he spat, his words trembling now not with power, but with fear. No one answered. The silence was the town's verdict. He turned his horse sharply and rode into the darkness, his men trailing behind, their torches flickering out one by one. The field was ruined, the cabin scorched, but still standing. She leaned against Isaiah, her breath ragged, her face streaked with soot. Around them, the townsfolk lingered, their eyes avoiding hers not out of shame this time, but out of something like respect. Mrs. Wilkes was the first to speak. "You'll need help rebuilding," she said simply. "We'll bring what we can in the morning." Clara, she barely remembered that was her name anymore, couldn't speak, only nodded as the first light of dawn began to pale the sky. Isaiah's arm wrapped around her shoulders, his hand steady, grounding. The fire had tried to take everything, but in its ashes, something unexpected had been born. Courage. The town had seen enough cruelty to know which side of the flames it wanted to stand on. For the first time, the world around them felt like it might just begin again. The morning after the fire dawned gray and heavy, the air still thick with the smell of smoke and wet ash. The cabin stood blackened but upright, its charred beams a testament to what had been endured and what refused to fall. She rose before Isaiah did, slipping from beneath the blanket as he slept, his hand still bandaged from the night's work. The weight of what needed doing pressed against her chest like the memory of a chain she no longer wore. By the time the first light crept across the prairie, she had saddled the horse, tucked the folded document deep into her coat, and ridden toward town with the cold wind biting at her face. Each hoofbeat carried her closer to the reckoning she'd been too afraid to seek, and by the time she reached the courthouse steps, her heart felt like a war drum. The magistrate looked up as she entered, his spectacles low on his nose, his expression already forming a frown. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, his tone half suspicion, half habit. "Or should I say my name?" She cut in sharply. "No man owns it now." He blinked, startled, and she pulled the worn paper from her coat, placing it flat on the desk between them. The seal had faded, the ink bled by time and sweat, but the words were still legible. "Certificate of manumission." Her husband's name appeared in the fine script of a witness, not as a grantor but as a liar, proof that Isaiah Cole had been a free man long before Dalton ever put a claim on him. "This," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "was found in the old chest he thought I'd never open, signed by a general, dated before the war ended. He was never a slave. He was free, and Dalton knew it." The magistrate leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles, his lips parting as he read. "If this is genuine," he murmured, "then your husband's claim to ownership his sale of a person was fraud." "It was worse than fraud," she said. "It was theft. He stole another man's life and used the law to make it seem right." The words echoed in the quiet room, And for the first time, she saw doubt not toward her, but toward the man who had ruled this town for far too long. The door creaked open behind her, and murmurs spread like wildfire as word traveled fast through the courthouse halls. Men and women gathered in the doorway, the same faces that had once laughed or looked away. When the magistrate finally looked up again, his face had hardened with something close to shame. "Mrs. Hensley," he said slowly, "this will go before the territorial judge. But the evidence here—" He glanced toward the door, where Sheriff Calder stood pale and uncertain. "I believe the law may finally remember what justice looks like." By the time she stepped outside, the crowd had grown, whispers chasing her like shadows. But this time, they weren't about scandal, they were about truth. A few tipped their hats. Others simply moved aside, making room for her to pass. Dalton appeared near the edge of the street, his clothes disheveled, his eyes hollow. He stared at her as though seeing a ghost that refused to haunt the way he'd intended. "You think this changes anything?" He spat, voice cracking. "You think that piece of paper makes you righteous?" She looked at him, calm and cold as stone. "No," she said. "It just makes you nothing." His mouth opened, but no sound came. The crowd behind her had turned silent, watching the man who had once controlled their every whisper now stripped of his power by truth itself. The magistrate stepped out onto the porch and called to the deputy. "Take him into custody. Fraud, coercion, and unlawful bondage." Dalton's face went red, then white, his pride collapsing faster than his words could form. As the deputies took his arms, the town didn't cheer. It didn't need to. Justice wasn't loud, it was quiet, final, and real. When she mounted her horse to ride home, she felt the sun breaking through the clouds, warm against her face. The road stretched wide before her, the ashes of the night's fire behind, and for the first time, she wasn't running from the past. She was riding into the life she and Isaiah had fought to claim. The papers tucked inside her coat were more than proof of freedom. They were the end of one man's power and the beginning of another's peace. Spring returned slowly to the valley, softening the scarred land with green shoots that pushed through the soot like stubborn hope. The cabin stood again, rebuilt by calloused hands and quiet perseverance, its new timber bright against the memory of charred ruin. Smoke curled from its chimney each morning, not as a signal of distress but of life continuing, stronger than before. She often woke before dawn, the warmth of the fire flickering across the walls, Isaiah's steady breathing beside her a rhythm as sure as her own. There was a peace in those small sounds, the creak of the floorboards, the hiss of the kettle, the muted laughter that had begun to return to their days. The town, once cruel in its silence, had begun to shift like thawing ground. When they rode in together for supplies, no one spat or turned away anymore. Some nodded, some met her gaze, and others, quietly ashamed, offered a word, a gesture, a hat tip that spoke more than apologies could. The world had not forgotten what it once was, but it had begun to learn what it might still be. She carried that knowledge like a prayer. In the evenings, when the work was done and the sky bled gold across the horizon, she and Isaiah sat on the porch, the scent of wildflowers carried by the wind. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't need to. His hand would brush hers, and in that simple touch was everything: trust, respect, love without ownership or expectation. The ache of the past never fully vanished. It lived in their scars, in the memories of fire and fear. But now those scars were not marks of shame, they were proof of survival. Once, she'd believed freedom was something granted by men, something written in ink or bought through pain. Now she knew better. Freedom was a choice made every morning to stay, to build, to love, to live. She often thought of the woman she used to be, the one who stood silent at her husband's side, her beauty fading under his cruelty, her voice lost to fear. That woman was gone, buried with the ashes of the life he'd tried to own. The woman who remained was of her own making, one forged in defiance and tenderness, one who knew her worth not by how the world saw her, but by how she saw herself reflected in the eyes of the man who had never called her his. Isaiah moved beside her now, his rough hand resting over hers, his eyes fixed on the horizon as though seeing something far beyond the land they'd mended together. "Never thought I'd have a home again," he said softly. She turned to him, smiling. "You built it," she whispered. "We built it." He looked at her then, the corners of his mouth lifting into a smile that carried the weight of every hardship, every grace they'd earned. In that moment, the world fell quiet, not the kind of silence that oppressed, but the kind that held peace. She leaned into his shoulder, feeling the warmth of him, the steadiness, the truth. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolled, faint and slow, and she thought of how time moved differently now, not by loss, not by pain, but by love growing steady in the soil they'd reclaimed. The whispers would never fully stop. There would always be tongues too small to understand what hearts could hold, but she no longer feared them. Their words were smoke, hers was fire. And in Isaiah's arms, beneath the vast unbroken sky, she was no man's possession, no one's property or prize. She was a woman reborn from the ashes, loved not because she was given, but because she chose to stay. The wind swept across the fields, warm and endless, carrying with it the sound of two hearts at peace, no longer fugitives of the past, but builders of something the world had no name for yet. Love, freedom, dignity, life. The beginning of everything they had been told they could never have, and the quiet proof that they had taken it back.